Hey there. I am back to talk to you pretty briefly today about a concept that we've danced around, but I think haven't explicitly defined in this course, which is economic liberalization. That's going to be an important trend in the recent history of most of the countries that we talk about in this course, but most immediately, it's quite relevant to the last 40 years or so of Mexican history, so I wanted to give you a quick intro to that concept. Economic liberalization, in brief, means reducing constraints imposed by the state or by the government on economic behavior. It means, in more layman's terms, getting the government out of the economy. Although, if I ask you to define that term in an exam context, you want to use slightly more formal language than that. It generally entails a shift from a more interventionist model towards a liberal political economic system, towards laissez-faire capitalism, but specifically from the position of the government having previously intervened in the economy and now dialing back those restrictions. Neoliberalism is a related term that has a bunch of complex meanings that you'll sometimes hear attributed to people who advocate economic liberalization. But it has a bunch. The term neoliberalism has a bunch of complex meanings that we might or might not have time to dig into in the constraints of this course. A couple of common ways of doing economic liberalization, particularly in the states that we study in this course. One is that there's lots of countries that have, at various points in their history, imposed price and wage controls. So they might have a minimum wage. They might actually have maximum prices for certain goods, which is unusual coming from an American context, but is not super unusual in the context of many other countries, particularly those that have been through a lot of economic or political turmoil. So if I want to liberalize the economy, one thing that I do is to relax or to abolish those controls on the market, and I just let the market forces, I just let the bargaining between buyers and producers, between buyers and sellers, fix the prices of goods, of services, of labor. A second example is that there's lots of countries that provide subsidies to their consumers. So the government just kicks in some money to lower the price of specific goods. In a lot of the countries we study, for instance, that's common in the energy sector. Gas is cheaper for consumers than it actually would be without those subsidies because the state kicks in money to make it cheaper. So if I want to liberalize my economy, I might reduce or abolish subsidies on particular goods. Privatization is a really big one, especially in the context of post World War II economies in the 50s, 60s, 70s. You'll see a number of states adopting this policy called import substitution industrialization, in which they try to become more economically independent by having the state spend a bunch of money to establish often partially or totally state owned businesses that do things like extract oil and natural gas or produce cars or whatever it is that that country thought was necessary in order to reduce its dependence on foreign manufactured goods. In the shift towards economic liberalization that's been more common in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, you've started to see a number of governments sell off those businesses, partially or completely, and allow private for profit companies to operate those businesses. So privatization is a major form of economic liberalization. Um, a fourth thing is for states to sign free trade agreements with other countries or to join international organizations like the World Trade Organization that lower barriers to trade. And so you'll see countries engaged in economic liberalization on an international level, reducing their tariffs, meaning their taxes on imports, reducing controls on what manufacturers can export from their countries to other countries, and reducing other regulatory barriers to trade. So they might, for instance, reduce the environmental standards that they apply to the manufacture of imported goods. Liberalizing trade relations is also a major, major part of economic liberalization. Finally, I'm not going to get into this because I don't understand monetary policy well enough to teach it competently. But it used to be a few decades ago quite common for governments to try and fix the exchange rate of their currency with an internationally widely used currency, such as the American dollar or the British pound. And in recent decades, it's been common for countries to relax those currency controls or stop fixing the exchange rate of their currency and just let their currency float so that international market forces determine the exchange rate between, say, the Mexican peso and the American dollar. Again, that's complicated. It takes me a while to explain it. So if you ask me a question in class, I will do my damnedest to figure it out, but not going to delve into it super deeply for the purposes of AP Comp Gov. Just one thing to note is that in this course, we also talk frequently about political liberalization, which is kind of what it sounds like in that different meaning of the term liberal that I'm sure you find annoying by now. Political liberalization often means some steps towards democratization. You might increase the role of elections or the freedom and fairness of elections. You might relax controls on free speech or freedom of the press. You might reduce state control over the media. You might allow for the creation of more competitive political parties with a lower barrier to entry into political competition for elected office. All those things are forms of political liberalization, but in this course, you do want to be able to distinguish between political and economic liberalization and know which one to talk about when you're asked a question about one or the other. Um, just a couple of illustrations of global trends. It's really hard to nail down quantitatively, objectively, exactly how liberalized an economy is, but I'm going to show you two different sources of data that suggest that in the last 50 to 75 years, the global economy, the trend in the world has been towards economic liberalization. One of those is trade openness. So on this chart, the darker green a country is, the more it depends on imports and exports, so the greater share global trade contributes to its GDP. And I'm just going to go by 10-year increments from 1950. Here's 1960. Here's 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, and then the most recent data we have are for 2017. And that global trend towards greater dependence on or openness to trade suggests that the global trend has been towards economic liberalization, particularly in the area of trade with other countries. The other thing is an index called the Index of Economic Freedom, and you can probably guess the ideological bias inherent in naming something like that, which is an attempt to compare economic openness, economic liberalization across countries and over time. Sorry, my bread is done. By the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative-leaning think tank. And what you see is a very slight trend. They only started doing this in 1995, so this doesn't go super far back. This doesn't go, for instance, to the Cold War period. But you'll see a very slight trend upwards in global economic freedom, in global economic liberalization. And then you'll also, if I put our case study countries, China is the purple one that's covered by my face. You'll see slight upward trends, but a lot more individual variation in most of our case study countries for this course as well. But to the extent that there has been a liberalizing trend in the global economy, it's worth thinking a little bit about the forces that have brought that about. And I'm just going to hypothesize a few ones quickly for you. The first is that a lot of states where you've seen extensive government intervention in the economy have not done a super good job of managing their economy from a purely economic perspective, because a state-owned entity, a state-owned business, is often going to be responsive to considerations other than pure economic efficiency or productivity when making business decisions. And so there's been concerns about political motives and also just a lack of good information about what people want and how to best produce goods and services that have kind of undermined the productivity and the competitiveness of state-owned or partially state-owned enterprises. Similarly, there's been some concerns in a bunch of different contexts that state-owned or partially state-owned enterprises are more susceptible to corruption. And we'll talk about that in basically every country in this course that is producing significant amounts of oil and natural gas, because that's where those problems tend to be most prominent. A second reason why the global economy might have liberalized over the last 50 some years is that there's competition for foreign investment. As multinational corporations have become a bigger and bigger force in the global economy, different states have to compete with one another in order to attract investment. And one way to get, say, Nike to open a factory in your country is to actually be able to say, hey, we don't have super tight regulations on what you can do here in terms of environmental impact, in terms of safety, in terms of social responsibility, in terms of minimum wage laws, in terms of working conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And so there has been, and particularly critics of economic globalization use the term race to the bottom to describe this, where different relatively low-income countries are lowering their standards and lowering their protections for workers and for the environment in an attempt to outbid their neighbors for foreign direct investment. You could frame that as a positive or a negative development depending on your view, but either way, that competition can be a force for economic liberalization. And then finally, there's lots of international pressure on a political level as well that might push states towards economic liberalization. So, for instance, but starting in the 80s or 90s, maybe international institutions, specifically the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, started attaching to conditions to their loans and their aid packages to some developing countries, in which they said, we'll lend you this money to bail you out of financial crisis, or we'll give you this money and forgive the loans for economic development purposes, but in return, you have to implement certain economic liberalization policies. And those policies are known as structural adjustment policies. They're associated with what you read about called the Washington Consensus back in Unit 1 when we talked about political economy and globalization. So sometimes states opted to reduce their state intervention in the economy in order to get access to those international loans or aid. And then similarly, other states have entered into trade agreements with each other, or they've joined the World Trade Organization. And those are political agreements that carry with them the obligation to liberalize the economy in certain ways. And when we get to Mexico very soon, we'll talk about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, as a source of pressure for economic liberalization in Mexico. And we'll think a little bit about its impacts. I'm going to leave you finally with just a couple of questions to consider about economic liberalization in order to push your thinking a little bit deeper. Most basically, we always want to think about who wins and who loses from economic liberalization. If you emerge from this course thinking that economic liberalization is good for everybody or bad for everybody, then you haven't grasped the concept very clearly. There are winners and losers from this development, and you can make an argument about whether it's overall or a good or a bad idea, or what the best way is to go about it. But you do want to be able to think about who's going to be relatively benefited and relatively disadvantaged by specific policies of economic liberalization. Second, there's been kind of a consensus or a default assumption almost among many Americans specifically and many Western political scientists more generally that since the end of the Cold War, political and economic liberalization go hand in hand. And there was this kind of burst of enthusiasm among many Americans, especially sort of on the right of the political spectrum, in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the transition away from communist rule in much of Eastern Europe. There was this kind of burst of optimism that as their economies liberalized and as they shifted towards democracy, this was going to be like a global shift in politics. And this was the final triumph of democracy over dictatorship. But more recently, specifically in some of those Eastern European countries, we've actually seen a shift away from political liberalization without as much of an attendant shift back towards communism or back towards state control of the economy. And so it's worth questioning that assumption that political and economic liberalization always move in the same direction. And that should sound similar to the modernization theory that I asked you to read about in O'Neill a week or two ago. Finally, and this is revisiting a question that we asked when we talked about globalization in the first unit, what is the interaction between liberalization and sovereignty? Is a state that engages in economic liberalization actually increasing its state's capacity to do more useful things that are the appropriate role of state institutions, or is it surrendering some degree of sovereignty to international organizations and to multinational corporations? So that's some food for thought. I will leave it there, and we'll talk about this stuff in the context of Mexico when I see you next. Thanks.